1910.1026, Chromium, 6. 1910.1026, Scope. 1910.1026, 1. This standard applies to occupational exposures to chromium, 6, in all forms and compounds in general industry, except 1910.1026, 2. Exposures that occur in the application of pesticides regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency or another federal government agency, e.g., the treatment of wood with preservatives. 1910.1026, 3. Exposures to Portland cement, or 1910.1026, 4. Where the employer has objective data demonstrating that a material containing chromium or a specific process, operation, or activity involving chromium cannot release dusts, fumes, or mists of chromium, 6, in concentrations at or above 0.5 gm/m3 as an 8-hour time-weighted average, TWA, under any expected conditions of use. 1910.1026, b. Definitions. For the purposes of this section, the following definitions apply. Action level means a concentration of airborne chromium, 6, of 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter of air, 2.5 gm/m3, calculated as an 8-hour time-weighted average, TWA. Assistant Secretary means the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health, U.S. Department of Labor, or designee. Chromium, 6, hexavalent chromium or Cr6, means chromium with a valence of positive 6, in any form and in any compound. Director means the Director of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or designee. Emergency means any occurrence that results, or is likely to result, in an uncontrolled release of chromium, 6. If an incidental release of chromium, 6, can be controlled at the time of release by employees in the immediate release area, or by maintenance personnel, it is not an emergency. Employee exposure means the exposure to airborne chromium, 6, that would occur if the employee were not using a respirator. High-efficiency particulate air, HEPA, filter means a filter that is at least 99.97% efficient in removing monodispersed particles of 0.3 micrometers in diameter or larger. Historical monitoring data means data from chromium, 6, monitoring conducted prior to May 30, 2006, obtained during work operations conducted under workplace conditions closely resembling the processes, types of material, control methods, work practices, and environmental conditions in the employer's current operations. Objective data means information such as air monitoring data from industry-wide surveys or calculations based on the composition or chemical and physical properties of a substance demonstrating the employee exposure to chromium, 6, associated with a particular product or material or a specific process, operation, or activity. The data must reflect workplace conditions closely resembling the processes, types of material, control methods, work practices, and environmental conditions in the employer's current operations. Physician or other licensed healthcare professional, PLHCP, is an individual whose legally permitted scope of practice, i.e., license, registration, or certification, allows him or her to independently provide or be delegated the responsibility to provide some or all of the particular healthcare services required by paragraph K of this section. Regulated area means an area, demarcated by the employer, where an employee's exposure to airborne concentrations of chromium, 6, exceeds, or can reasonably be expected to exceed, the PL. This section means this section 1910.1026 Chromium, 6, Standard. 1910.1026, C, Permissible Exposure Limit, PEL. The employer shall ensure that no employee is exposed to an airborne concentration of chromium, 6, in excess of 5 micrograms per cubic meter of air, 5 gm/m3, calculated as an 8-hour time-weighted average, TWA. 1910.1026, D, Exposure Determination. 1910.1026, D1, General. Each employer who has a workplace or work operation covered by this section shall determine the 8-hour TWA exposure for each employee exposed to chromium, 6. This determination shall be made in accordance with either paragraph D2 or paragraph D3 of this section. 1910.1026, D2, Scheduled Monitoring Option. 1910.1026 D2I through 1910.1026 D2-6. The employer shall perform initial monitoring to determine the 8-hour TWA exposure for each employee on the basis of a sufficient number of personal breathing zone air samples to accurately characterize full shift exposure on each shift, for each job classification, in each work area. Where an employer does representative sampling instead of sampling all employees in order to meet this requirement, the employer shall sample the employees expected to have the highest Chromium-6 exposures. If initial monitoring indicates that employee exposures are below the action level, the employer may discontinue monitoring for those employees whose exposures are represented by such monitoring. If monitoring reveals employee exposures to be at or above the action level, the employer shall perform periodic monitoring at least every 6 months. If monitoring reveals employee exposures to be above the PL, the employer shall perform periodic monitoring at least every 3 months. If periodic monitoring indicates that employee exposures are below the action level, and the result is confirmed by the result of another monitoring taken at least 7 days later, the employer may discontinue the monitoring for those employees whose exposures are represented by such monitoring. The employer shall perform additional monitoring when there has been any change in the production process, raw materials, equipment, personnel, work practices, or control methods that may result in new or additional exposures to Chromium-6, or when the employer has any reason to believe that new or additional exposures have occurred. 1910.1026 D3 Performance-oriented option. The employer shall determine the 8-hour TWA exposure for each employee on the basis of any combination of air monitoring data, historical monitoring data, or objective data sufficient to accurately characterize employee exposure to Chromium-6. 1910.1026 D4 Employee notification of determination results. 1910.1026 D4 I. Within 15 workdays after making an exposure determination in accordance with paragraph D2 or paragraph D3 of this section, the employer shall individually notify each affected employee in writing of the results of that determination or post the results in an appropriate location accessible to all affected employees. 1910.1026 D4 2. Whenever the exposure determination indicates that employee exposure is above the PL, the employer shall describe in the written notification the corrective action being taken to reduce employee exposure to or below the PL. 1910.1026 D5 Accuracy of measurement. Where air monitoring is performed to comply with the requirements of this section, the employer shall use a method of monitoring and analysis that can measure Chromium-6 to within an accuracy of plus or minus 25%, plus or minus 25%, and can produce accurate measurements to within a statistical confidence level of 95% for airborne concentrations at or above the action level. 1910.1026 D6 Observation of monitoring. 1910.1026 D6 I. Where air monitoring is performed to comply with the requirements of this section, the employer shall provide affected employees or their designated representatives an opportunity to observe any monitoring of employee exposure to Chromium-6. 1910.1026 D6 2. When observation of monitoring requires entry into an area where the use of protective clothing or equipment is required, the employer shall provide the observer with clothing and equipment and shall assure that the observer uses such clothing and equipment and complies with all other applicable safety and health procedures. 1910.1026 E. Regulated areas. 1910.1026 E1 Establishment. The employer shall establish a regulated area wherever an employee's exposure to airborne concentrations of Chromium-6 is, or can reasonably be expected to be, in excess of the PL. 1910.1026 E2 Demarcation. The employer shall ensure that regulated areas are demarcated from the rest of the workplace in a manner that adequately establishes and alerts employees of the boundaries of the regulated area. 1910.1026 E3 Access. The employer shall limit access to regulated areas to 1910.1026 E3 I through 1910.1026 E3 3 persons authorized by the employer and required by work duties to be present in the regulated area. Any person entering such an area as a designated representative of employees for the purpose of exercising the right to observe monitoring procedures under paragraph d of this section, or any person authorized by the Occupational Safety and Health Act or regulations issued under it to be in a regulated area. 1910.1026 F. Methods of compliance. 1910.1026 F1. Engineering and work practice controls. 1910.1026 F1 I. Except as permitted in paragraph F1, 2, and paragraph F1, 3 of this section, the employer shall use engineering and work practice controls to reduce and maintain employee exposure to chromium, 6, to or below the PL unless the employer can demonstrate that such controls are not feasible. Wherever feasible, engineering and work practice controls are not sufficient to reduce employee exposure to or below the PL, the employer shall use them to reduce employee exposure to the lowest levels achievable, and shall supplement them by the use of respiratory protection that complies with the requirements of paragraph G of this section. 1910.1026 F1, 2. Where painting of aircraft or large aircraft parts is performed in the aerospace industry, the employer shall use engineering and work practice controls to reduce and maintain employee exposure to chromium, 6, to or below 25 gm/m3 unless the employer can demonstrate that such controls are not feasible. The employer shall supplement such engineering and work practice controls with the use of respiratory protection that complies with the requirements of paragraph G of this section to achieve the PL. 1910.1026 F1, 3. Where the employer can demonstrate that a process or task does not result in any employee exposure to chromium, 6, above the PL for 30 or more days per year, 12 consecutive months, the requirement to implement engineering and work practice controls to achieve the PL does not apply to that process or task. 1910.1026 F2. Prohibition of rotation. The employer shall not rotate employees to different jobs to achieve compliance with the PL. 1910.1026 G. Respiratory protection. 1910.1026 G1. General. Where respiratory protection is required by this section, the employer must provide each employee an appropriate respirator that complies with the requirements of this paragraph. Respiratory protection is required during 1910.1026 G1 I through 1910.1026 G1 the periods necessary to install or implement feasible engineering and work practice controls. Work operations such as maintenance and repair activities, for which engineering and work practice controls are not feasible. Work operations for which an employer has implemented all feasible engineering and work practice controls and such controls are not sufficient to reduce exposures to or below the PL. Work operations where employees are exposed above the PL for fewer than 30 days per year, and the employer has elected not to implement engineering and work practice controls to achieve the PL, or emergencies. 1910.1026 G2. Respiratory Protection Program. Where respirator use is required by this section, the employer shall institute a respiratory protection program in accordance with section 1910.134, which covers each employee required to use a respirator. 1910.1026 H. Protective work clothing and equipment. 1910.1026 H1. Provision and use. Where a hazard is present or is likely to be present from skin or eye contact with chromium, 6, the employer shall provide appropriate personal protective clothing and equipment at no cost to employees, and shall ensure that employees use such clothing and equipment. 1910.1026 H2. Removal and storage. 1910.1026 H2 I through 1910.1026 H2 4. The employer shall ensure that employees remove all protective clothing and equipment contaminated with chromium, 6, at the end of the work shift or at the completion of their tasks involving chromium, 6, exposure, whichever comes first. The employer shall ensure that no employee removes chromium, 6, contaminated protective clothing or equipment from the workplace, except for those employees whose job it is to launder, clean, maintain, or dispose of such clothing or equipment. When contaminated protective clothing or equipment is removed for laundering, cleaning, maintenance, or disposal, the employer shall ensure that it is stored and transported in sealed, impermeable bags or other closed, impermeable containers. The employer shall ensure that bags or containers of contaminated protective clothing or equipment that are removed from change rooms for laundering, cleaning, maintenance, or disposal are labeled in accordance with the requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard, Section 1910.1200. 1910.1026 H3 Cleaning and Replacement. 1910.1026 H3 I through 1910.1026 H3 3. The employer shall clean, launder, repair, and replace all protective clothing and equipment required by this section as needed to maintain its effectiveness. The employer shall prohibit the removal of chromium 6 from protective clothing and equipment by blowing, shaking, or any other means that disperses chromium 6 into the air or onto an employee's body. The employer shall inform any person who launders or cleans protective clothing or equipment contaminated with chromium 6 of the potentially harmful effects of exposure to chromium 6, and that the clothing and equipment should be laundered or cleaned in a manner that minimizes skin or eye contact with chromium 6 and effectively prevents the release of airborne chromium 6 in excess of the PL. 1910.1026 I. Hygiene areas and practices. 1910.1026 I.1. General. Where protective clothing and equipment is required, the employer shall provide change rooms in conformance with 29 CFR 1910.141. Where skin contact with chromium 6 occurs, the employer shall provide washing facilities in conformance with 29 CFR 1910.141. Eating and drinking areas provided by the employer shall also be in conformance with Section 1910.141. 1910.1026 I.2. Change rooms. The employer shall assure that change rooms are equipped with separate storage facilities for protective clothing and equipment and for street clothes, and that these facilities prevent cross-contamination. 1910.1026 I.3. Washing facilities. 1910.1026 I.3. I. The employer shall provide readily accessible washing facilities capable of removing chromium 6 from the skin and shall ensure that affected employees use these facilities when necessary. 1910.1026 I.3. 2. The employer shall ensure that employees who have skin contact with chromium 6 wash their hands and faces at the end of the work shift and prior to eating, drinking, smoking, chewing tobacco or gum, applying cosmetics, or using the toilet. 1910.1026 I.4. Eating and drinking areas. 1910.1026 I.4. I. Whenever the employer allows employees to consume food or beverages at a worksite where chromium 6 is present, the employer shall ensure that eating and drinking areas and surfaces are maintained as free as practicable of chromium 6. 1910.1026 I.4. 2. The employer shall ensure that employees do not enter eating and drinking areas with protective work clothing or equipment unless surface chromium 6 has been removed from the clothing and equipment by methods that do not disperse chromium 6 into the air or onto an employee's body. 1910.1026 I.5. Prohibited activities. The employer shall ensure that employees do not eat, drink, smoke, chew tobacco or gum, or apply cosmetics in regulated areas, or in areas where skin or eye contact with chromium 6 occurs, or carry the products associated with these activities, or store such products in these areas. 1910.1026 J. Housekeeping. 1910.1026 J.1. General. The employer shall ensure that 1910.1026 J.1 I through 1910.1026 J.1 2 all surfaces are maintained as free as practicable of accumulations of chromium 6. All spills and releases of chromium 6 containing material are cleaned up promptly. 1910.1026 J.2 Cleaning methods. 1910.1026 J.2 I. The employer shall ensure that surfaces contaminated with chromium 6 are cleaned by HEPA filter vacuuming or other methods that minimize the likelihood of exposure to chromium 6. 1910.1026 J.2 2 Dry shoveling, dry sweeping, and dry brushing may be used only where HEPA filtered vacuuming or other methods that minimize the likelihood of exposure to chromium 6 have been tried and found not to be effective. 1910.1026 J.2 3 The employer shall not allow compressed air to be used to remove chromium 6 from any surface unless 1910.1026 J.2 3 A through B. The compressed air is used in conjunction with a ventilation system designed to capture the dust cloud created by the compressed air, or no alternative method is feasible. 1910.1026, J, 2, 4. The employer shall ensure that cleaning equipment is handled in a manner that minimizes the re-entry of chromium, 6, into the workplace. 1910.1026, J, 3. Disposal. The employer shall ensure that 1910.1026, J, 3, I, through 1910.1026, J, 3, 2, waste, scrap, debris, and any other materials contaminated with chromium, 6, and consigned for disposal are collected and disposed of in sealed, impermeable bags or other closed, impermeable containers. Bags or containers of waste, scrap, debris, and any other materials contaminated with chromium, 6, that are consigned for disposal are labeled in accordance with the requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard, 29 CFR 1910.1200. 1910.1026, K. Medical Surveillance. 1910.1026, K1, General. 1910.1026, K1, I. The employer shall make medical surveillance available at no cost to the employee, and at a reasonable time and place, for all employees. 1910.1026, K1, A, through C. Who are or may be occupationally exposed to chromium, 6, at or above the action level for 30 or more days a year, experiencing signs or symptoms of the adverse health effects associated with chromium, 6, exposure, or exposed in an emergency. 1910.1026, K1, 2. The employer shall assure that all medical examinations and procedures required by this section are performed by or under the supervision of a PLHCP. 1910.1026, K2, Frequency. The employer shall provide a medical examination. 1910.1026, K2, I, through 1910.1026, K2, 6, within 30 days after initial assignment, unless the employee has received a chromium, 6, related medical examination that meets the requirements of this paragraph within the last 12 months. Annually, within 30 days after a PLHCP's written medical opinion recommends an additional examination. Whenever an employee shows signs or symptoms of the adverse health effects associated with chromium, 6, exposure. Within 30 days after exposure during an emergency which results in an uncontrolled release of chromium, 6, or at the termination of employment, unless the last examination that satisfied the requirements of paragraph K of this section was less than 6 months prior to the date of termination. 1910.1026, K3. Contents of examination. A medical examination consists of 1910.1026, K3, I, through 1910.1026, K3, 3. A medical and work history, with emphasis on past, present, and anticipated future exposure to chromium, 6. Any history of respiratory system dysfunction, any history of asthma, dermatitis, skin ulceration, or nasal septum perforation, and smoking status and history. A physical examination of the skin and respiratory tract, and any additional tests deemed appropriate by the examining PLHCP. 1910.1026, K4. Information provided to the PLHCP. The employer shall ensure that the examining PLHCP has a copy of this standard, and shall provide the following information. 1910.1026, K4, I, through 1910.1026, K4, 4. A description of the affected employee's former, current, and anticipated duties as they relate to the employee's occupational exposure to chromium, 6. The employee's former, current, and anticipated levels of occupational exposure to chromium, 6. A description of any personal protective equipment used or to be used by the employee, including when and for how long the employee has used that equipment, and information from records of employment-related medical examinations previously provided to the affected employee, currently within the control of the employer. 1910.1026, K5. PLHCP's written medical opinion. 1910.1026, K5, I. The employer shall obtain a written medical opinion from the PLHCP within 30 days for each medical examination performed on each employee, which contains 1910.1026, K5, I, A, through C. The PLHCP's opinion as to whether the employee has any detected medical conditions that would place the employee at increased risk of material impairment to health from further exposure to chromium, 6. Any recommended limitations upon the employee's exposure to chromium-6 or upon the use of personal protective equipment such as respirators. A statement that the PLHCP has explained to the employee the results of the medical examination, including any medical conditions related to chromium-6 exposure that require further evaluation or treatment, and any special provisions for use of protective clothing or equipment. 1910.1026, K5, 2. The PLHCP shall not reveal to the employer specific findings or diagnoses unrelated to occupational exposure to chromium-6. 1910.1026, K5, 3. The employer shall provide a copy of the PLHCP's written medical opinion to the examined employee within 2 weeks after receiving it. 1910.1026, L. Communication of chromium-6 hazards to employees. 1910.1026, L1, Hazard Communication General. 1910.1026, L1I, through 1910.1026, L1, 3, chemical manufacturers, importers, distributors and employers shall comply with all requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard, HCS, Section 1910.1200, for chromium-6. In classifying the hazards of chromium-6, at least the following hazards are to be addressed: cancer, eye irritation, and skin sensitization. Employers shall include chromium-6 in the Hazard Communication Program established to comply with the HCS, Section 1910.1200. Employers shall ensure that each employee has access to labels on containers of chromium-6 and to safety data sheets, and is trained in accordance with the requirements of HCS in paragraph L2 of this section. 1910.1026, L2, Employee Information and Training. 1910.1026, L2I, the employer shall ensure that each employee can demonstrate knowledge of at least the following. 1910.1026, L2I, A, through B, the contents of this section, and the purpose and a description of the medical surveillance program required by paragraph K of this section. 1910.1026, L2, the employer shall make a copy of this section readily available without cost to all affected employees. 1910.1026, M, Record Keeping. 1910.1026, M1, Air Monitoring Data. 1910.1026, M1I, the employer shall maintain an accurate record of all air monitoring conducted to comply with the requirements of this section. 1910.1026, M1-2, this record shall include at least the following information. 1910.1026, M1-2A, through F, the date of measurement for each sample taken, the operation involving exposure to chromium-6 that is being monitored, sampling and analytical methods used in evidence of their accuracy, number, duration, and the results of samples taken, type of personal protective equipment, such as respirators worn, and name and job classification of all employees represented by the monitoring, indicating which employees were actually monitored. 1910.1026, M1-3, the employer shall ensure that exposure records are maintained and made available in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.1020. 1910.1026, M2, Historical Monitoring Data. 1910.1026, M2I, where the employer has relied on historical monitoring data to determine exposure to chromium-6, the employer shall establish and maintain an accurate record of the historical monitoring data relied upon. 1910.1026, M2-2, the record shall include information that reflects the following conditions. 1910.1026, M2-2A, through E, the data were collected using methods that meet the accuracy requirements of paragraph D5 of this section. The processes and work practices that were in use when the historical monitoring data were obtained are essentially the same as those to be used during the job for which exposure is being determined. The characteristics of the chromium-6 containing material being handled when the historical monitoring data were obtained are the same as those on the job for which exposure is being determined. Environmental conditions prevailing when the historical monitoring data were obtained are the same as those on the job for which exposure is being determined. And other data relevant to the operations, materials, processing, or employee exposures covered by the exception. 1910.1026, M2-3, The employer shall ensure that historical exposure records are maintained and made available in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.1020. 1910.1026 M3 Objective Data. 1910.1026 M3 I. The employer shall maintain an accurate record of all objective data relied upon to comply with the requirements of this section. 1910.1026 M3 2. This record shall include at least the following information. 1910.1026 M3 2 A through E. The chromium containing material in question, the source of the objective data, the testing protocol and results of testing or analysis of the material for the release of chromium. 6. A description of the process, operation, or activity and how the data support the determination, and other data relevant to the process, operation, activity, material, or employee exposures. 1910.1026 M3 3. The employer shall ensure that objective data are maintained and made available in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.1020. 1910.1026 M4 Medical Surveillance. 1910.1026 M4 I. The employer shall establish and maintain an accurate record for each employee covered by medical surveillance under paragraph K of this section. 1910.1026 M4 2. The record shall include the following information about the employee. 1910.1026 M4 2 A through C. Name. A copy of the PLHCP's written opinions. A copy of the information provided to the PLHCP as required by paragraph K4 of this section. 1910.1026 M4 3. The employer shall ensure that medical records are maintained and made available in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.1020. 1910.1026 N. Dates. 1910.1026 N1. For employers with 20 or more employees, all obligations of this section, except engineering controls required by paragraph F of this section, commence November 27, 2006. 1910.1026 N2. For employers with 19 or fewer employees, all obligations of this section, except engineering controls required by paragraph F of this section, commence May 30, 2007. 1910.1026 N3. Except as provided in N4, for all employers, engineering controls required by paragraph F of this section shall be implemented no later than May 31, 2010. 1910.1026 N4. In facilities that become parties to the settlement agreement included in Appendix A, engineering controls required by paragraph F of this section shall be implemented no later than December 31, 2008.